He told the twin girls to leave without looking up. Minutes later, a single photograph shattered his world. By the time he realized who they were, it was almost too late. One decision, 2 6-year-old lives, and a truth that changed everything forever. The revolving doors of the lakefront financial center turned without pause, glass panels swallowing people in tailored coats and releasing them just as easily. No one noticed when 2 small figures slipped inside, their timing precise, their movements quiet enough to disappear into the morning rush. Ivy Hart walked slightly ahead. Her chin lifted, her small hand gripping her sister's sleeve. Wren followed, half a step behind, eyes wide but focused, counting her breaths the way their mother had taught her. 1, 2, 3. Don't stop. Don't look back. They were 6 years old. Too young to be here. Too young to understand glass towers and security protocols and the way adults decided who belonged and who didn't, but they knew one thing with painful clarity. He was inside. Cold air clung to their thin coats as the warmth of the lobby rushed over them. Marble floors gleamed beneath their worn sneakers. Voices echoed, business voices, important voices, words about deadlines and numbers and meetings that meant nothing to the girls, threading through them like shadows. A security guard glanced up from his desk, distracted by a ringing phone. The moment passed. The chance did not return. Ivy tightened her grip. Now she whispered barely sound at all. They moved faster, slipping between legs, past rolling suitcases and swinging briefcases, hearts hammering too loudly in their chests. To anyone who noticed, they were just children who had taken a wrong turn. No one stopped them. No one asked. Above them, the elevators waited, tall metal doors that opened and closed like mouths deciding who to swallow. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't curiosity. It was a plan built from whispered hospital conversations, from nights spent listening to machines breathe for their mother, from one sentence spoken softly but firmly. If anything happens to me, you find him. The elevator doors began to close. Ivy lunged forward, dragging Wren with her, just as a voice shouted behind them, "Hey, the doors sealed shut!" And the building began to rise. The elevator hummed as it climbed, numbers blinking past too fast for Wren to follow. She pressed her back against the mirrored wall, her reflection staring back at her pale face, red coat, too thin for winter eyes, far older than 6. Ivy stood in the center, feet planted as if the floor might tilt if she didn't anchor it. She didn't know how elevators worked. She only knew they went up. And he was up. When the doors slid open, the hallway beyond was quiet, carpeted, the air softer, heavier. Ivy stepped out first, scanning the signs the way she had practiced in her head. Letters, logos, arrows, all leading in one direction. Kincaid Development Group. Wren's fingers tightened around something in her pocket. The edge of it bent warm from her hand. She didn't look at it. Looking made things harder. They walked quickly, their steps swallowed by thick carpet, passing closed doors and framed photos of buildings that scraped the sky. Everything here felt permanent, powerful, untouchable. They were none of those things. At the end of the hallway, one door stood open. Inside, a man sat behind a wide desk, his head lowered, attention locked on papers spread like a fortress in front of him. His suit was dark, perfect, his posture rigid, controlled. The world bent to his schedule. Graham Kincaid. Ivy took one step inside. The sound was small, almost nothing, but it was enough. Graham looked up sharply, irritation already forming as his eyes searched for the interruption. His gaze landed on 2 little girls standing in his office, red coats bright against steel and glass. For a fraction of a second, something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or the echo of it. "What is this?" he demanded, already rising from his chair. "Who let you in here?" Ivy opened her mouth. No sound came out. Behind them, hurried footsteps thundered closer. And the moment began to fracture. Graham Kincaid did not like surprises. He liked structure, control, meetings that started on time and ended early. Children did not belong in his office, and certainly not two of them, standing silently in the middle of his carefully ordered world. "Where are your parents?" he asked sharply, already glancing toward the door. This was a security failure, a problem, one that needed to be removed before it became visible. Ivy swallowed hard. Her chest felt too tight. She had practiced the words 100 times in her head, but now they were gone, stuck somewhere between fear and hope. Ren stepped forward instead. She lifted her hand slightly as if to show him something, or maybe to steady herself. Before she could do either, voices echoed in the hallway. Sir Security Graham's jaw tightened. He didn't want this. He didn't want questions. He didn't want a scene. "You need to leave," he said, cutting the air between them. "Right now." The words landed heavy. Ivy froze. Ren's hand dropped back to her side. Neither girl cried. They simply looked at him, blue eyes steady, unreadable in a way that made something in Graham's chest twist without explanation. Then Ivy nodded once. They turned and walked toward the door just as the guards arrived, apologizing, reaching for them with careful hands. The girls went quietly, escorted out the way they had come in. The office fell silent again. Graham exhaled, rubbing his temples, already trying to erase the interruption. He turned back to his desk, and that was when he saw it. A photograph lay on the polished surface, placed there with intention. The breath left his lungs all at once, because the woman smiling back at him was someone he had buried years ago, and sending those girls away had just become the worst mistake of his life. The door closed softly behind the security guards, and the office returned to its controlled stillness. The hum of the building pressed in again, distant and obedient, as if nothing unusual had happened. Graham Kincaid remained standing. For a moment he did nothing. His hands rested on the edge of the desk, fingers spread, knuckles pale. He told himself this was just another interruption, another problem that had wandered into his day and been removed. Children did not belong here. That was all. He straightened his jacket, exhaled slowly, and sat back down. The chair creaked under his weight, a familiar sound that usually grounded him. But something felt wrong. The air seemed heavier, as if the room itself had shifted while his back was turned. Graham's gaze dropped to the desk, already searching for his pen. His phone, something solid to anchor him back to the present. That was when he saw it. A photograph lay near the edge of the desk, slightly crooked, its corners worn and soft as though it had been handled often. It hadn't been there before. He was certain of that. His heart skipped once, then again. Graham reached for it slowly, as if sudden movement might make it disappear. His fingers brushed the surface, and a chill ran up his arm that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The woman in the photograph was smiling. Not the polished smile of corporate headshots or gala photos, but something softer. Private. Familiar in a way that made his chest tighten painfully. Elena. The name formed in his mind before he could stop it. His grip tightened around the edges of the photo as memories surged forward without warning. Elena laughing in his kitchen when he burned dinner. Elena standing in a doorway late at night, asking him if he planned to keep choosing work over everything else. Elena walking away with a single suitcase and a look he had never been able to forget. Graham's breath came shallow now. His eyes flicked back to the door to the hallway where two little girls had disappeared moments ago. Two girls with blue eyes. Two girls who hadn't cried. Two girls who had walked into his office as if they knew exactly where they were going. "No," he muttered, though the word felt weak even as he said it. The photograph trembled in his hand, and suddenly the silence of the office felt like accusation. Graham lowered himself into the chair, the leather cold against his back. He stared at the photograph as if it might change if he looked long enough, as if Elena's face would blur into someone else's. It didn't. Time folded in on itself. He remembered the night she had told him she was leaving, No shouting, no dramatic exit, just exhaustion in her eyes and a quiet certainty that terrified him more than anger ever could. "I need more than promises," she had said. "I need presence." He hadn't answered. He had believed then that silence was safer than choosing wrong. Now sitting alone in an office he owned, surrounded by a life he had built piece by piece. Graham felt the sharp edge of that mistake with painful clarity. His thoughts returned uninvited to the girls. Ivy, Wren. He hadn't known their names then, but he knew them now. The way one had stepped forward protectively. The way the other had watched him not with fear, but with quiet assessment. Children learned that look when adults disappointed them. "How old would they be?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The answer came immediately. 6. His stomach twisted. Graham stood abruptly and crossed the office in long strides, pressing the intercom button with more force than necessary. "Lock the exits," he said, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. "I want the 2 children who were just here found and brought back immediately." There was a pause. "Sir, now," he snapped. He released the button and began pacing the polished floor, reflecting his restless movements. Every second stretched too long. Every passing moment felt like something slipping further out of reach. He told himself this was about responsibility, about security, about making sure they weren't lost in the city. But the truth pulsed beneath those excuses. If he was wrong, he needed to know. And if he was right. His phone buzzed on the desk. He ignored it. Another buzz, then another. Nothing mattered except the image burned into his mind, 2 small figures walking away carrying something fragile he had never known existed. The intercom crackled again. Sir, a guard said carefully, "We lost them. They exited the building before we could stop them." Graham stopped pacing. For the first time in years, control slipped through his fingers. The words echoed long after the intercom went silent. "We lost them." Graham stood frozen, his hand still hovering near the desk, as if he might rewind time by force of will alone. The city outside the glass walls continued its relentless motion, cars crawling along the streets, people moving with purpose, unaware that something irreversible had just happened. "Find them," he said finally, his voice cracking despite his effort to contain it. "Search the area. Call the police if you have to. They're alone." The guard didn't argue. He nodded and disappeared. Graham sank back into his chair, the weight of the room pressing down on him. He stared at the photograph again, his thumb brushing over Elena's face as if the paper might suddenly warm beneath his touch. How long had she been sick? How long had she known she was running out of time? And how many nights had she spent deciding whether to send their daughters to him after everything he had failed to be? The thought burned. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls of glass and steel, Ivy and Wren were walking through a city that did not know their names. 2 6-year-old girls carrying fear, hope, and a future he had never planned for. Graham pushed back from the desk and stood grabbing his coat without thinking. Meetings could wait. Calls could be ignored. For the first time since he had built his empire, money and authority felt useless. He strode out of the office, assistants scrambling in his wake, their questions unanswered. The elevator ride down felt endless, every floor, another reminder of how high above the ground he had lived, how far removed from consequences. When the doors finally opened, cold air rushed in as he stepped outside. His tie was loose now. His image fractured his eyes, scanning the crowded plaza with a sharp intensity that made people step aside. And then he saw them. Near the curb, small and impossibly still. 2 red coats against the gray winter city. Graham slowed his steps, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might shatter. Up close, they looked even smaller than they had in his office. The confidence gone, replaced by exhaustion and quiet resolve. He stopped a few feet away. "Ivy," he said, carefully testing the name. Then Wren. Both girls looked up at the sound of his voice, not surprised, as if they had been waiting. Graham stopped a few steps away, afraid that if he moved too fast, they might run. The city pressed in around them, engines idling, shoes scraping concrete, fragments of conversation floating past without meaning. Yet in that small pocket of space, everything felt unnaturally still. Ivy rose first. She didn't rush him. She didn't hide behind her sister. She simply stood, shoulders squared, as if she had decided something long before this moment. Ren stayed seated on the low concrete edge, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes never leaving his face. "You came," Ivy said. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was a statement of fact. Graham crouched slightly, lowering himself so they were closer to eye level. The cold seeped through his trousers, but he didn't notice. Up close, the resemblance was impossible to deny. The same eyes, the same steady seriousness that Elena used to wear when she was weighing whether to trust him. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, struggling to keep his voice even. "It's not safe." Ren tilted her head. "You told us to leave." The words landed cleanly. No anger, no accusation, just truth. Graham nodded slowly. "I did," he admitted. "I was wrong." Ivy studied him with an intensity that made him feel as though he were the child being evaluated. "Are you going to tell us to go again?" she asked. "No," he said immediately. The answer surprised him with its certainty. "I won't." Ren's fingers loosened slightly in her lap, but she didn't relax. "You didn't even look at us," she said quietly. "Not really." Graham inhaled the breath sharp in his chest. "I see you now." Silence stretched between them. A bus hissed to a stop nearby. Somewhere someone laughed. "Did you see the picture?" Ivy asked. "Yes," he replied. "Your mother, Elena." Ren's gaze dropped to the ground. "She said you would know what it meant." A heaviness settled in Graham's chest. "Where is she?" he asked, even though dread already twisted in his stomach. Ivy's voice was steady. "She's in the hospital." Ren added softly, "She's very sick." The city seemed to tilt. Graham reached out without thinking, his hand hovering near Ivy's shoulder, stopping just short. "Why did you come to me?" he asked. Ivy met his eyes. "Because she told us if anything happened to her, she said we should find you." They sat together on the cold concrete, the distance between them smaller now, but still careful. Graham shrugged out of his coat and draped it over Ren's shoulders before she could object. She stiffened at first, then slowly relaxed, pulling it closer. "She said you would understand," Ivy continued, "even if you didn't want to." Graham swallowed hard. "Did she tell you who I am?" he asked. Ren shook her head. "She said you were important," she replied, "and that you used to love her." The words cut deeper than anything else had. Graham looked between them, searching their faces for doubt, for confusion, for anything that would let him believe this was coincidence. He found none. Only exhaustion. Only a kind of quiet bravery no 6-year-old should have needed. "How long has she been sick?" he asked. Ivy hesitated. "A long time," she said. "Longer than she let us know." Ren picked at a loose thread on the edge of Graham's coat. "She told us not to be scared," she said softly. "But she cried when she thought we were asleep." Graham closed his eyes briefly, the image unbearable. He had built towers, negotiated contracts, bent entire city blocks to his will, and had missed this. "I didn't know," he said again, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "I swear to you, I didn't know." Ivy watched him closely. "She thought you didn't," she said after a moment. "That's why she didn't send us sooner." Ren looked up, then her eyes bright with unshed tears. "She said you were busy building things," she whispered, "and that sometimes people forget to look down." The sentence lodged itself in Graham's chest. "Can you take us to her?" Ivy asked. Not pleading, asking. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Right now." He stood and offered his hands. Ivy took his immediately. Wren hesitated only a second longer before slipping her small hand into his other one. Her grip was firm, as if she were anchoring herself to something solid for the first time. As they walked toward his car, Graham felt the weight of the moment settle in fully. This wasn't about fixing a mistake. This was about facing something he had avoided for years. The past wasn't buried. It was waiting. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and quiet fear. Automatic doors slid open as they entered, releasing a rush of warm air that made Wren shiver. Graham guided them inside, gently, his hands steady even as his chest tightened with every step. This world was nothing like glass towers and corner offices. There were no sharp lines here, no polished confidence, only muted colors, tired faces, and the constant hum of machines that didn't ask permission to be heard. The twins seemed to know exactly where to go. Ivy walked with purpose, turning corners without hesitation. Wren stayed close to Graham's side, now her shoulder brushing his leg, as if to reassure herself he was still there. "You've been here before," he said quietly. "Yes," Ivy replied. "Every day." They stopped in front of a door that was slightly open. Ivy's hand tightened around his. "She's in there," she said. For the first time since the girls had walked into his office, Graham hesitated. Memories surged: Elena's laughter, her disappointment, the way she had looked at him the last night they stood together in silence. Seeing her like this felt heavier than any negotiation he had ever faced. Wren leaned closer and whispered, "She's tired today." Graham nodded, though his throat felt too tight to speak. He pushed the door open slowly. Elena lay in the hospital bed, smaller than he remembered, her dark hair thinner, her skin pale against the white sheets. Tubes and wires traced quiet paths across her body, silent witnesses to a battle already far along. For a moment, she didn't notice them. Then Ivy stepped forward. "Mom," she said softly. Elena's eyes shifted toward the door, and when they landed on the twins, something in her face softened instantly. A fragile smile appeared, summoned by sheer will. "My brave girls," she whispered. Wren hurried to her side, careful not to bump the bed, taking her mother's hand with both of hers. Ivy climbed onto the chair beside her, pressing close. Only then did Elena's gaze lift and find Graham. Recognition flickered. Surprise followed, then understanding. "So," Elena said quietly, her voice weak but steady, "you finally looked down." Graham took a step forward, every instinct screaming for him to say something that would bridge the years between them. No words came, only the truth standing silently between a dying woman, 2 children, and the man who had finally arrived. The room felt smaller with all of them inside it. Machines hummed softly beside the bed, their rhythm steady and indifferent, as if reminding everyone that time moved forward, no matter how carefully people chose their words. Graham stood at the foot of the bed, hands clenched at his sides, unsure where to place himself in a space shaped by illness and history. Elena broke the silence first. "You weren't supposed to meet like this," she said quietly, her gaze shifting between him and the girls. "I hoped I'd have more time." Ivy stayed close to the bed, one hand resting protectively on her mother's arm. Wren sat on the chair's edge, legs dangling, watching Graham with open seriousness. "Why didn't you tell me?" Graham asked finally, his voice low and strained. "About them. About any of this." Elena closed her eyes for a moment, gathering strength. "Because you were already gone," she replied. "Not physically, but here." She tapped her chest weakly. "I didn't want them growing up waiting for someone who might never show up." The words settled heavily. "I didn't know," Graham said again, frustration and regret tangled together. "If I had, you would have tried to fix it," Elena interrupted gently. "And some things can't be fixed. They can only be carried." Wren shifted uncomfortably. "Are you mad at him?" she asked her mother. Elna smiled faintly. "No," she said. "I'm tired." Ivy looked between them. "Mom said we should come anyway," she explained. "Just in case." Elena's eyes glistened. You were always braver than me, she murmured to her daughters. Graham stepped closer, lowering himself into the chair beside the bed. The distance between them was no longer measured in years, but in inches. I can't change what I didn't know, he said carefully. But I'm here now. Elena studied his face, searching for something beneath the suit, beneath the authority. I don't need promises for myself, she said softly. I need one for them. Graham followed her gaze to the twins, two small lives shaped by absence standing in the quiet aftermath of choices made long ago. They won't be alone, he said without hesitation. Not now. Not ever. Elena exhaled slowly, relief flickering across her tired features. That's all I needed to hear, she whispered. The conversation shifted after that, losing its sharp edges, settling into something quieter and heavier. The girls stayed close to their mother, instinctively aware that every moment mattered. Later, a nurse appeared at the door, her voice gentle but firm. She needs to rest, she said. Ivy nodded immediately. Ren hesitated, then leaned forward to press a kiss against Elena's hand. We'll be back, she whispered. As they stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind them, the hospital seemed louder, brighter, less forgiving. They found seats in the waiting area, the vinyl chairs cold beneath them. Ren swung her legs slowly, her movements restless now that the adrenaline had faded. Ivy sat very still, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Graham sat between them, unsure what to do with his hands, until Ren reached out and slipped her fingers into his. Ivy followed a moment later, her grip lighter but deliberate. She's scared, Ivy said quietly, staring at the opposite wall. She doesn't like it when the machines get louder. Graham nodded. I know, he replied, though he hadn't until now. Ren looked up at him. Are you scared? He considered the question honestly. Yes, he said. Very. She seemed satisfied with that answer. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by distant footsteps and the soft call of a nurse's voice. Finally, Graham spoke. When I was younger, he said, I thought building things meant making them strong enough that nothing could break them. Ivy glanced at him. Did it work? He shook his head. No. But I think I understand now. Ren leaned against his arm, her head resting there as if it belonged. The simple weight of her felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed. I don't know how to do this perfectly, he said quietly. I'll make mistakes. Ivy met his eyes. Everyone does. Yes, he agreed. But I will stay. The words stayed between them, solid and unpolished, and for the first time it felt real. The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm. Graham canceled meetings without explanation. Assistants whispered. Phones went unanswered. None of it mattered. Every morning he drove the twins to the hospital. Sometimes they talked in the car, filling the silence with observations about clouds or traffic lights. Other times they sat quietly. Ren's forehead pressed to the window, Ivy watching the road ahead, as if memorizing it. Elena's condition shifted unpredictably. Some days she was awake. Her voice steady enough to tell stories from before the girls were born, small memories passed forward like fragile gifts. Other days she slept almost constantly, her breathing shallow, her body fighting a battle it was slowly losing. One evening, as rain streaked down the hospital windows, Elena asked to see Graham alone. The twins hesitated at the door. I'll be right outside, Graham promised, kneeling slightly so they could see his face. I'm not going anywhere. Ren's fingers lingered in his sleeve before she let go. Inside the room, Elena looked smaller than ever. You're trying, she said softly. I can see that. I should have tried sooner. Graham replied, his voice rough. I can't change that, but I won't repeat it. Elena studied him carefully. They'll test you, she warned. Grief doesn't make sense. Some days they'll push you away. I know, he said. I'll still choose them. She closed her eyes briefly, relief softening her features. "Then maybe this won't break them," she whispered. When the door opened again, the twins rose immediately. Ren leaned into Graham's side. Ivy slipped her hand into his. No one said anything, but something irreversible had already taken hold. Staying was no longer an idea. It was a choice, one that would have to be made again and again. Night settled over the hospital slowly, the kind of quiet that felt heavier than noise. The lights in the hallway dimmed, casting long shadows across the floor. Somewhere down the corridor, a machine beeped steadily, indifferent to the weight pressing inside one particular room. Elena was awake again. Her eyes followed Graham as he stood near the window, watching rain slide down the glass in thin, uneven lines. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Silence had become familiar now, not awkward, not empty, but full of things that no longer needed to be said out loud. "She knows," Elena said finally. Graham turned. "About me?" he asked. Elena nodded. "About you. About what you are to them." He swallowed. "I told them. I know." Her lips curved faintly. I could see it in their faces. A nurse appeared, briefly checking monitors, adjusting a line, then leaving them alone again. The door closed softly, sealing them back into the quiet. "There's something I need to hear," Elena continued. Her voice was calm, but the effort behind it showed. "And I need it to be honest." Graham stepped closer, pulling a chair beside the bed. "Ask me." "When I'm gone," she said. Meeting his eyes directly, "Will you still choose them when it's hard?" The question landed without softness. This wasn't about warm mornings or quiet bedtime stories. It was about grief-driven anger, sleepless nights, the days when one twin would shut down while the other lashed out. It was about blame, resentment, and the slow erosion of patience. Graham didn't look away. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. Even then, Elena studied him carefully, as if measuring the weight of his answer against the man she once knew. After a long moment, she nodded. "That's all I needed," she whispered. The door opened again, and Ivy and Ren slipped back inside. They moved instinctively, Ren to the chair, Ivy to the bed, each taking a familiar place. Ivy climbed carefully beside her mother, pressing close while Ren reached for Elena's hand, holding it with both of hers. "I'm tired," Elena murmured. "We know," Ivy said softly. Ren leaned forward. "You can sleep," she added. "We're here." Elena smiled at them, her gaze lingering as if she were memorizing every detail. "You were the best thing I ever made," she said quietly. Graham watched from the side, his chest tight, knowing this moment was slipping away even as it unfolded. The room grew still, and time for once did not hurry. It was early morning when Ren shook Graham awake. He had fallen asleep, sitting upright in a chair in the waiting room, his coat still on his phone dead beside him. For a moment he didn't understand where he was, or why his body felt so heavy. Then he saw Ren's face. Her eyes were wide, dry, too calm. "She's not waking up," she said softly. The words cut through him instantly. Graham was on his feet before he fully understood what was happening. Ivy appeared beside Ren, silent, her jaw clenched tight, her hand gripping her sister's sleeve as if anchoring herself. They moved together down the hallway, the familiar path suddenly foreign, distorted by dread. Graham pushed the door open. Elena lay still. Her face was peaceful in a way that felt wrong. Too still. Too quiet. The machines that had filled the room with sound now whispered softly, as if aware that their work was done. Ivy froze just inside the doorway. Ren rushed forward, climbing onto the chair beside the bed, taking her mother's hand and holding it tightly. "Mom," she whispered. "We're here." No response. Graham stepped closer, placing a hand gently on Ivy's shoulder. He felt her body trembling beneath his touch. A nurse entered quietly, followed by a doctor. Their movements were careful, practiced. Words were exchanged softly, professionally. When the sentence was finally spoken aloud, It landed with a finality that stole the air from the room. "I'm sorry." Wren leaned back against Graham's chest, her small body collapsing into him, as if the strength holding her upright had finally given out. The sound that came from her then was raw and unguarded, a sob pulled from somewhere deep and painful. Ivy didn't cry at first. She climbed onto the bed, carefully curling beside her mother, pressing her forehead against Elena's arm. Her shoulders shook, silent tears soaking into the white sheets. Graham stood behind them, his arms around both girls, feeling utterly powerless. He had arrived too late to fix anything, but he was here. The nurse stepped back, giving them space. Minutes passed, or hours. Time lost its shape. Finally, Ivy spoke, her voice barely audible. She promised she wouldn't leave us. Graham tightened his hold. "I know," he said. "And it's okay to be angry." Wren cried harder at that, clinging to him, as if he were the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. And for the first time, Graham understood that this was not a moment to be managed. It was a moment to be survived. The days after the funeral blurred together, marked not by calendars or schedules, but by mood swings and sleepless nights. Some mornings, Ivy woke up quiet and distant, moving through the house like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to. Other days, Wren exploded over small things, spilled milk, a missing sock, anger bursting out where words failed. Graham learned quickly that grief did not follow rules. One night, long after the house had gone quiet, he found Ivy sitting on the floor of her room, surrounded by drawings. She was tearing one of them into small pieces, her movements precise and furious. "She should be here," Ivy said suddenly. "She said she'd watch me go to school." Graham sat down beside her, the carpet cold beneath him. "I know," he said, "and it's okay to miss her." Wren appeared in the doorway moments later, her eyes red, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Are you going to leave too?" she asked. The question hit him harder than anything else had. "No," he said immediately, standing and pulling both girls into his arms. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." They didn't relax right away. Trust he was learning didn't return all at once. It came in fragments, in small moments, helping with homework, sitting through nightmares, staying calm when one pushed him away and the other clung too tightly. Weeks passed. Slowly, the house changed. Toys appeared in corners. Drawings went up on the fridge. Mornings became loud and messy. Evenings meant shared dinners and quiet conversations that wandered from serious questions to sudden laughter. One afternoon, Ivy looked at him from across the table. "You stayed," she said. "Yes," Graham replied. Wren nodded seriously. "You keep staying." The words felt like a verdict. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep, Graham stood in the hallway between their rooms, listening to the steady rhythm of their breathing. Grief still lived in the house. It always would. But it no longer lived alone. For the first time in his life, Graham Kincaid understood that fatherhood was not something you proved once. It was something you chose, again and again. The truth didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived the way Graham Kincaid understood best, quietly, clinically, through documents and signatures and sterile rooms where emotions didn't belong. 3 days after the twins first walked into his office, Graham sat alone in a private clinic's waiting room. The carpet was too clean. The air smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant. A magazine lay untouched on the table beside him, the same smiling faces on the cover, the same empty promises of better living. He didn't flip a page. He kept seeing Ivy's steady eyes. Wren's question. "Are you going to leave too?" A nurse called his name. Graham stood straightening his jacket, as if fabric could hold him together. He followed her down a corridor, past closed doors, into a small office where the lights were bright enough to make everything feel exposed. "Are you ready?" the nurse asked gently. He wasn't, but he nodded anyway. The test itself was simple, almost insulting in its simplicity. A swab, a sealed envelope, a line of ink on paper. The kind of process he'd used to verify billion-dollar deals. The kind of process that had never made his hands shake before. Afterward, he sat in his car in the parking lot, engine off, staring through the windshield at a gray sky. For a moment, he let the silence swallow him. This wasn't about fear of responsibility. It was fear of regret. If the results were negative, he could exhale. He could tell himself he'd overreacted, that fate had played a cruel trick, and then walked away. But if they were positive, then every birthday, every first word, every fever night and scraped knee and whispered, "Mom, I'm scared." All of it had happened without him. Later that day, he visited Elena. She looked tired, but her eyes sharpened when she saw him. "You did it," she said softly, as if she'd expected nothing less. "I had to know," Graham replied, standing beside her bed. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. Elena's gaze slid toward the twins who were coloring quietly at the small hospital table. Ivy concentrated with fierce seriousness. Ren chewed the cap of a marker, her shoulders tense, listening, even when she pretended not to. "I wondered how long it would take you," Elena said, not bitter, just honest. Graham's jaw tightened. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked again, though the anger had softened into something heavier. "Why let it get this far?" Elena turned her face toward the window where pale light fell across the sheets. "Because I was afraid you'd fight for them like a possession," she said. "And I needed you to fight for them like a father." The sentence landed like a verdict. Graham had no answer. Not then. Not yet. Because in that moment he understood that love, real love, didn't demand control. It demanded surrender. And the results were coming. The call came on a morning that looked ordinary from the outside. Chicago traffic, coffee cups, people hurrying with their heads down. Graham drove to the clinic alone. He didn't bring an assistant. He didn't schedule a meeting afterward. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. This wasn't business. This was a door in his life that had been locked for years, and he was about to turn the key. The receptionist handed him an envelope and a neutral smile. "You can open it here," she said. Graham nodded, but he didn't sit down. He walked back out to his car, closed the door, and held the envelope in both hands like it might burn him. For a long moment, he stared at his own name printed in black ink. Then he tore it open. The paper inside was clean organized, covered in clinical language designed to remove emotion from reality. But one line cut through everything. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. Graham's lungs forgot how to work. His hands tightened around the page as if crushing it might change what it said. His throat burned. His vision blurred and he blinked hard, refusing to let tears win in a place that had never required them before. 6 years. 6 years of lives lived without him. He saw them in fragments, imagined scenes he'd never witnessed. 2 tiny babies held against Elena's chest. 2 little girls learning to walk, one pulling the other forward. 2 pairs of small hands reaching for their mother in the dark. And no father. Not even a shadow. Graham pressed his forehead against the steering wheel. He had faced lawsuits, public humiliation, market crashes, and ruthless competitors. Nothing had ever made him feel this powerless. When he finally lifted his head, he wiped his face with the back of his hand, furious at himself for needing to. He folded the paper carefully, like respect mattered now, and placed it back into the envelope. Then he sat there, breathing unevenly, letting the truth settle into his bones. This wasn't a problem to solve. This was a life to show up for. He drove to the hospital with the envelope on the passenger seat like a second heartbeat. When he entered Elena's room, she knew immediately, not because he said anything, but because his face had changed. Elena's eyes closed briefly, a quiet exhale, relief small and exhausted. "You have your answer," she whispered. Graham's voice cracked. "They're mine," Elena nodded. "Yes." He looked toward the twins. Ivy glanced up for a moment, studying him the way she always did. Ren watched him longer, her expression unreadable, like a child trying to recognize a stranger through familiar eyes. Graham crouched beside them. "I need to tell you something important," he said softly. Ivy sat up straighter. Wren's fingers curled around her marker. He hesitated, the words too large. And then, because Elena's breathing sounded weaker today, because time felt cruel, because truth mattered, Graham spoke carefully, choosing meaning over biology. "I'm part of your family," he said. "I didn't know about you before, but I know now." Ivy didn't flinch. She only asked, "Are you staying?" Wren whispered, almost too quiet to hear, "For real." Graham nodded. "For real." And in Elena's bed, a woman who had carried everything alone let herself rest just a little. He waited until after the funeral to say the word out loud. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because the twins had already lost too much. Their mother's absence was a wound so fresh it seemed to bleed through the air itself. Adding another truth, one that could change how they understood every memory, felt like lighting a match near spilled gasoline. So Graham stayed quiet. He stayed present. He learned their routines. In grief, Ivy grew silent, organizing her pain into neat lines the way she organized her school supplies. Wren turned stormy anger, snapping out when she couldn't find words for the hollow place in her chest. And Graham remained. One night, nearly 2 weeks after the funeral, the house was dark except for a lamp in the living room. Rain tapped at the windows. The twins sat on the floor with a pile of drawings between them, pictures of Elena with a sun drawn too large in the corner, as if they could brighten the world by force. Wren tore one drawing in half suddenly. "I hate it," she said, voice shaking. "I hate that she's not here." Ivy didn't scold her. She just watched, jaw-clenched, tight eyes, glossy but stubborn. Graham sat down on the carpet, close enough to be there, far enough not to crowd them. "It's okay to hate it," he said quietly. "I do too." Wren looked up, sharply surprised. "You don't get to," she said, the anger raw. "You weren't even here before." The words hit like a slap. Graham nodded once. "You're right," he said. "I wasn't." Silence thickened. He reached for the envelope he'd kept in his desk drawer, the paper inside folded so many times it had become soft at the creases. He didn't wave it like proof. He didn't use it like a weapon. He simply placed it on the floor between them. "I took a test," he said, "because I needed to know the truth, and because your mom wanted me to choose you the right way." Ivy's eyes narrowed slightly. What truth? Graham's throat tightened. He forced the words out gently, as if volume could break them. "That I'm your father." Wren froze. Ivy didn't move at all. The rain kept tapping at the window like it didn't care. Finally, Ivy asked, voice small but steady, "So, you're our dad?" "Yes," Graham said, voice rough. "If you'll let me be." Wren's eyes filled instantly. "Mom said you would," she whispered. She just didn't know when. Something inside Graham broke quietly, completely. He leaned forward and wrapped his arms around both girls, careful, like he was holding something fragile that might disappear if he squeezed too tightly. Ivy hesitated only a second before leaning in her forehead, pressing against his shoulder, as if she had been carrying the weight alone for too long. Wren collapsed into him, sobbing, fingers clutching the fabric of his shirt. And in that dim living room, surrounded by drawings and grief and rain, Graham made a vow without ceremony, without witnesses, without escape routes. "I'm here," he whispered into their hair. "I'm not leaving." He didn't feel ready. But readiness didn't matter anymore. Only staying did. Life did not slow down after the truth was spoken. If anything, it became heavier, denser with meaning, because every small decision now carried weight. Breakfast mattered. Bedtime mattered. The tone of a voice, the patience in a pause, the choice to stay instead of stepping away when exhaustion whispered excuses. Graham learned this quickly. Mornings were loud and imperfect. Ivy insisted on doing things herself, tying her shoes with careful concentration, jaw tight, when she failed and had to start again. Wren moved faster, messier emotions close to the surface, laughing one minute, dissolving into tears the next, when something reminded her of their mother. Graham learned not to rush either of them. He learned that Ivy needed space to process, not pressure to speak. He learned that Wren needed reassurance in words, not silence. He learned that grief showed up differently in the same house sometimes, at the same time. One night long after the girls had gone to bed, Graham sat alone at the kitchen table staring at a half-finished glass of water. He realized he was afraid not of losing control, but of failing quietly in ways no one would see until it was too late. He didn't know how to be a father. So he decided to learn. He rearranged his schedule without apology. He left meetings early. He said no to things he once would have chased without hesitation. Assistants adjusted. Board members questioned. Graham didn't explain. At night, when nightmares pulled Wren from sleep, he sat on the edge of her bed until her breathing steadied. When Ivy withdrew, retreating into books and drawings, he waited nearby, letting presence speak when words would have felt intrusive. One evening, Ivy looked up from her homework and asked, "Do you ever wish we weren't here?" The question was quiet, dangerous. "No," Graham answered immediately. "Never." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for cracks. Finding none, she nodded once and returned to her work. Later that same night, Wren padded into the hallway, clutching a blanket. "Can you stay until I fall asleep?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Always yes." Graham understood then that fatherhood wasn't proven in grand gestures or dramatic promises. It was built in ordinary days and ordinary nights. The first real test came quietly. A letter arrived in the mail one afternoon, its envelope plain official. Graham opened it at the counter while the twins colored at the table behind him. The words inside were careful, polite, and deeply unsettling questions about guardianship, about long-term arrangements, about whether he was prepared for permanence. Prepared. Graham folded the letter slowly, his expression unreadable. "Is something wrong?" Ivy asked, noticing the change in his posture. He turned toward them, choosing honesty over comfort. "Someone wants to make sure you're safe," he said, "and that you'll stay here." Wren's face fell instantly. "You mean, we might have to leave?" "No," Graham said firmly, kneeling in front of them. "That's not what I mean. I just need to say it out loud." "Say what?" Wren whispered. "That I choose you," he said. "Not because I have to, because I want to." Ivy's shoulders relaxed slightly. Wren leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his chest for a brief moment before pulling back. "Okay," Ivy said simply. "Then we're okay." The meetings that followed were quiet but resolute. Graham answered questions without deflection. He signed papers without hesitation. When asked about sacrifice, he didn't dress it up as nobility. "This isn't a loss," he said calmly. "It's a responsibility I should have taken sooner." Weeks passed. Spring crept into the city, softening the sharp edges winter had left behind. The twins started school. On the first morning, Ivy stood very still at the classroom door, her backpack clutched tight, her face unreadable. "You don't have to be brave," Graham said gently. "You just have to go inside. I'll be right here." She nodded and walked in without looking back. Wren hesitated longer, eyes wide. "You'll still be here?" "Yes," he said. "When you come out." She smiled faintly and followed her sister. Graham stayed where he was until the door closed. That afternoon, they burst through the school gates together, Ivy talking quickly, Wren laughing too loudly, both reaching for his hands as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As they walked home, the city humming around them, Graham felt something settle inside his chest. He knew now that this choice, this staying, would have to be made again and again. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to keep choosing it. Nearly a year after the morning, two small girls slipped through the revolving doors. Graham Kincaid brought them back to the Lakefront Financial Center. The building looked the same from the outside, glass and steel rising cleanly into the sky, confident and unyielding. But to Graham it felt smaller now, less powerful. as if it had been reduced to what it always was, just a place. Ivy and Wren stood beside him at the entrance, hands tucked into his coat pockets, their heads tilted up as they studied the towering facade. The winter air was softer this time, no longer sharp enough to sting. "This is where we found you," Wren said quietly. "And where I almost sent you away," Graham replied. Inside, the lobby buzzed with its usual rhythm, but people noticed the girls this time. Smiles followed them. A receptionist knelt to say hello. Someone held the elevator doors open without being asked. They rode up together, the mirrored walls reflecting a family that hadn't existed a year ago. Graham's office door stood open just as it had that day. Sunlight spilled across the floor, warming the space. The desk was the same, but one thing had changed. A photograph sat in a simple frame at the corner. Elena's smile looked just as it always had, soft, unguarded, real. Ivy approached the desk, slowly climbing into the chair Graham used to occupy. She spun once, then stopped herself, sitting very still. "You look strange over there," she said, pointing at him. He smiled. "Maybe this isn't where I belong anymore." Wren walked to the desk and touched the frame gently. "She's here," she said. "Yes," Graham answered. "She always will be." That evening they sat together on the couch at home, the lights dim, the city quiet beyond the windows. Wren yawned, curling against Graham's side, her head resting easily against his arm. Ivy leaned in from the other side, her weight solid and warm. "Do you remember when you told us to leave?" Ivy asked suddenly. "I do," Graham said. "I think about it a lot." "If you hadn't," Wren said sleepily, "we wouldn't have left the picture. And if you hadn't left the picture," Ivy added, "you wouldn't have followed us." Graham felt something warm and painful rise in his chest at the same time. "You're right," he said softly. "I needed to see it." Wren's eyes closed. Ivy's breathing slowed. Graham stayed still, letting the quiet settle, not empty this time, but full. Because sometimes the moment you don't look up becomes the moment that changes everything. And sometimes choosing to look down, really look, is the beginning of a life that finally feels real. Did this story move you? Share your thoughts in the comments and rate this story from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon so you don't miss other heartwarming stories. Click on the last screen to see the next emotional chapter waiting for you. See you in the next story.